Hello, everyone, and welcome to our NEEP Ready, Set, Scale webinar for February. My name is Erin Cosgrove. I'm the Public Policy Manager. As people come in, I'll encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat and say hello to everyone attending the webinar. Also, a couple of points to go over just before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. There's also closed captioning enabled. So if you would like to see closed captioning, there's a button to turn it on and off on the bottom of your screen. Everyone is entering on mute with the video off, but we encourage you to please use the chat to talk to each other, say hello, share ideas or comments on what we're talking about. And then we also have a Q&A where we ask you to please fill it up with any questions you have during this presentation. And we're hoping to leave at least half of the presentation at the end for a question and answer time driven by your questions. So please, if you think of anything, shoot them our way. And now I would also like to give a big thank you to our allies, funders, and partners who allow us to continue to do these wonderful webinars and create great resources on building decarbonization and energy efficiency throughout our region. And finally, I'll kick us off with a little introduction on NEEP, or the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships. So NEEP is a regional energy efficiency organization, and we seek to accelerate regional collaboration to promote energy efficiency, building decarbonization, and equitable, flexible, and a clean grid. We drive policy and market transformation through both collaboration and innovation, developing tools informed by policymakers and program implementers alike to drive the region towards our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And today, I'm very excited to say that we will be talking about demystifying measured programs. And so the reason why we have chosen this topic today is that measured programs are part of the funding coming into states from the Inflation Reduction Act. And so before we pass it off to our wonderful panelists, I'll give just a little bit of background. First, I'd like to mention that NEEP has some resources available right now on the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and also how you can think about implementing retrofit and grid flexible programs. But the big topic of today is the homes rebate portion of the IRA that contains about $4 billion to implement efficient electric programs. And it does this through proposing two ways to implement programs, modeled or measured. And modeled programs are something that the energy efficiency industry has been doing for quite a while, but now we're going to talk about measured programs and how these can help unlock additional savings and also provide a pathway for flexible grid technology. And so with that, I'm very excited to introduce our two presenters, Andy Frank and Carmen Best. First, Andy, founder and president of Sealed, will be coming on to discuss Sealed Works. And then also Carmen, Chief Policy Officer at Recurve, will be making an appearance, but then going into a presentation on how Recurve looks at these programs. And with that, we will pass it off to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin, and thanks so much to NEEP for having Carmen and I here. I'm really excited to talk about measured savings programs today. A little bit of brief background on Sealed as to why I'm excited. So Sealed, we are a climate tech company, and we have a mission to stop home energy waste and electrify all homes. And we've essentially been using a measured approach to energy efficiency and electrification for the past 10 years. We've done it in the context of a private financing program with homeowners, but we've learned a lot about how to make it work, and also have really seen a lot of the benefits that we'll talk about today, and certainly in our business, but more importantly in the market as a whole. So we're really excited about the IRA, as I know everyone on this webinar is, and we're particularly excited about the potential to leverage measured savings within the homes program, and excited to dive in. Great. So next slide. So what I want to kind of take take everyone through today is just a little introduction about what measured savings is and why it matters, which I think is really important. A little bit about how it works at a high level, a few real world examples that Carmen's gonna help me with, and what we feel are some keys to success from the policy front. And then very excited for Carmen to dive even deeper into what measured savings can mean from the grid perspective and kind of the potential for scale there. Next slide. So just a little bit about the homes program as a whole. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but just to review. So there are essentially three big pots of money for residential energy efficiency and electrification. There are the 25C tax credits, which are live as of January 1st of this year. There is the HERA program, which focuses on low and moderate income electrification rebates, which is awesome. And then there's the homes program. And the homes program is really focused on performance-based incentives for whole home approaches to saving energy and carbon. So things like weatherization, insulation, air sealing, as well as electrification, air source heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, basically things that make homes more comfortable with less energy. So there's $4.3 billion in the IRA over 10 years set aside for that. And there are two paths. So as Aaron mentioned, there is the modeled path that states can take that leverages kind of existing or could be developed new energy modeling software. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the history of that in a little bit. And then there's also a measured path. And the measured path, as we'll talk about, basically looks at actual energy reductions at the energy usage, at the meter, so to speak, to be able to calculate how much energy was reduced. In both paths, there is a 2x bonus for equity. So if you are a low to moderate income household, it means you get double the incentives than a market rate household, which also we think is really great. And then the last thing that we're really excited about, and Carmen's going to talk a lot more about, is that the homes program through the measured path really creates the potential for scaling virtual power plants. So basically turning the households that receive the incentives into a virtual power plant by providing incentives to those households or to the aggregators that serve them based on not just total energy usage, but also some combination of time, location, and greenhouse gas reduction. So again, I won't talk a lot about that. Carmen will, but really excited about that as well. Slide. So, what is measured savings? Very simply, it's a program approach that provides performance-based incentives using open source advanced measurement and verification software to determine energy usage before and after project installation. So you essentially are looking at how much energy a home uses before the project is installed, and you calculate a predicted counterfactual usage, and then you look at the actual post-install usage, usually adjusted for weather and sometimes other factors, to see how much energy is saved. Now, this is distinct from modeled savings estimates, which historically can be different from what those realized savings are based on post-install usage. So what the measured approach does is it ensures that the taxpayer money or in some cases the ratepayer money that's being invested in energy efficiency programs is only paying for the actual energy that's reduced as calculated based on actual energy reductions looking before and after. Next slide. So, why do we think this is important before we get into kind of more of the details? Well, we think, kind of across the board, the measured savings approach has a ton of potential. So the first is that it's more money per project. So the way the law is written, the modeled approach has a cap of incentives per home or per project of $4,000 for market rate projects and $8,000 for low to moderate income projects. With the measured approach, there's no cap. The incentives are paid based on, again, the actual energy reductions and a formula that's going to be a little bit different for each state. But if you calculate it kind of across the US, what that means is that you could get significantly more money per project, especially for bigger projects and especially for projects with low to moderate income households. And as I think, most of the folks on this webinar, are all too aware, it's really hard to drive adoption of efficiency and electrification with low to moderate income households. And we really need to be able to provide as much support for those households as possible. So we think that the measured approach really helps to help get us there. There's also higher accountability. So this is both at the consumer level and at the taxpayer level. At the consumer level, and this is something that we've seen in our business at Sealed a lot, it really makes a difference when there's a stakeholder involved that has true accountability for what the energy savings are going to be. It changes the way you approach the business, changes the way you think, it changes the way you really focus on the right kinds of QA and QC. And historically, most whole home programs have really struggled with realization rates. So in other words, the amount of actual energy savings divided by the estimated energy savings. And so when you kind of put that together, right, what it means is that if an individual home, much less a portfolio of homes, is not saving what was projected, that means that the work maybe was not done as well as it could have been. The right equipment was not selected. Something went wrong, and/or there was a too aggressive of a projection, which really hurts the expectations of those households. Again, particularly low to moderate income. So we think that the measured approach brings a level of accountability that otherwise wouldn't exist. And then at the taxpayer level, obviously, with any sort of major legislation, fraud, waste, and abuse is always a concern by policymakers, as is understandable. And so being able to only pay incentives based on actual measured reductions, we think helps to address that. And so if you add all that up, we think it also leads to a bigger impact. We've calculated that if all of the states only used a measured approach, which we don't think is realistic, but just to stress test that would be over 7 terawatt hours of energy savings over the IRA program lifetime, versus maybe only 3 or so terawatt hours under the model approach. And so we think that the impact really matters. And we also think that it can lead to greater simplicity. So the IRA caps administrative costs at 20%, and many programs spend more than that. And we think that measured can make sure that states are not going to have to go to their governors and legislatures to ask for additional administrative funding. Next slide. And so, of course, if you add that all up, right, it's the equivalent of over 700,000 cars driven for a year, 3.6 billion pounds of coal burned, and my favorite, almost 400 billion smartphones charged. I think I only make up a small percentage of those smartphone charging, but it all adds up. Next slide. Carmen, do you want to talk a little bit about the open source nature of all this?
Sure. Just really briefly, I wanted to just highlight the legislation calls for open source measurement and verification to be part and parcel to the implementation of the HOMES program. And over here at Recurve, we've been working on the Open EE meter, introduced it kind of several years ago, but it's really built on best practices from the measurement and verification world. It's open and accessible. It's governed right now under the LF Energy rubric, which is one of the largest open source governance organizations. So it has its own independence, and folks can get access to the code base and all of the components of a calculation, such that you can see what savings impacts are going to look like in a very transparent measurement framework. They're replicable, and most importantly, they're available without restriction. So it's not a proprietary access model. Keep an eye out. We'll be doing some more technical webinars on how that could look, but it's a really important piece of the program model such so people can kind of anticipate what performance measurements are going to be done and how they're going to affect their programs and their payments ultimately.
Great. Thanks, Carmen. So now let's dive into a little bit about, what this actually looks like and what we think the elements, at least from what Sealed's, seen in our business, what is needed to make the measured approach work. So next slide. So basically, the kind of nuts and bolts are program administrators, in the IRA's case, state energy offices, work to set up these programs, likely working with various program implementers. As Carmen said, this includes integrating advanced measurement and verification. That money then flows to what are called aggregators. A company like Sealed, for example, could be an aggregator. And what aggregators do is they source projects and provide upfront incentives to the market. So essentially, aggregators are taking the performance risk as well as the cash flow burden, because in a measured approach, right, we don't know how much energy is saved when you install the project. You have to wait, usually typically for at least a year. So aggregators are taking on that burden, and then they're passing the money on to the market, to contractors and to consumers. And there's a lot of benefits from that because you add a lot of flexibility to the market so that the market actors, the contractors and the consumers can choose what is the form of incentive or what are the form that takes that's going to provide the most value. So that could be rebates, financing buy downs, lowering prices, providing additional measures and services, et cetera. Can also mean contractors investing in their own business to hire more people, put money down on trucks, et cetera. Next slide. To make this work, though, we think it's really, really important, and we've seen this in our business, to really follow two guidelines around data, because you can't measure something that you don't have the data for. So the first is good, better, best. So we know that, some states like California, and Carmen's going to talk, about some case studies on that later, are doing really amazing stuff and are, kind of in the best camp, right? They've got lots of data from their local utilities and they've been able to put it together in really interesting ways. But there's other states, and most states, frankly, that are in the good camp. Sealed as a business, and the way we do measure it is in the good camp, to be able to run the measured approach. And there's trade-offs, of course. We want everyone to move to best, but the point here is that we don't need to require data to come directly from the utilities. There's other ways you can get the data, and there's ways to run the measured approach, even if there's no direct utility data cooperation. Next slide. So the other big framework here is all of the above. So Sealed's business, we don't get data directly from the utility. We get it from third-party tools. We get it from customers sending us energy bills. This includes, by the way, delivered fuels. So we're doing the measured approach with delivered fuels, oil, propane, et cetera. It can also involve newer technologies like wireless sensors that are able to capture data in a increasingly low-cost, high-functionality way to be able to get the data out of the home to be able to measure the results. Next slide. So a couple of real world examples, and actually, Carmen, do you want to take the first two really quick, and then I'll talk about Sealed?
Sure, happy to do so. So one of the two case studies that I'm going to go over are measured savings programs that Recurve has been involved in serving as the measurement. For this one in particular with Franklin Energy, we were serving as the advanced measurement and verification provider. And the interesting thing with this program is that it was designed to pay based on the savings that were delivered. It really looked like a typical HVAC program with quality maintenance and components like that at the beginning. But as the program was starting to roll out, they utilized the intel that they were getting from the measurement verification to make a pivot. And one of the pivots that they made to optimize the delivery of this program was to move more to an electrification model. They took out the quality maintenance component. Doesn't mean that there wasn't quality maintenance, it just wasn't a program standing alone by itself. In the course of implementing this program as well, they were able to really see how the optimization was happening with the grid value that was delivered from electrification and heat pumps. So it was delivering 20% peak reductions from the total program. And that was really where the high value impact was coming from, as opposed to the total savings that were happening over the entire year. That was the energy savings were happening over the whole year, but this was more of a peak impact program than I think anyone had really anticipated at the beginning, and it was really the analytics that helped reveal that. Someone noted in the chat realization rate here, since it had a measurement and verification component built into the program, unlike a deemed paradigm where you kind of forecast what your savings are going to be, and then the outcomes are something else. In this case, your reported savings are your measured savings. So your realization rate by definition is 100%. So let's move on to the next example. The other one is an instance where Recurve is serving as the program administrator. And in this program, we're using all of our analytical tools of measurement, verification, and pulling aggregators together to deliver a low income and a market rate simultaneously program. In this program, which is operating in California, it's a county, a consolidation of counties that is implementing the program. They pay for the performance on the base rate of the avoided cost calculator in California, which is just a projection of all the things that matter to California regulators, transmission, distribution, et cetera, but also GHG impacts and carbon impacts, methane impacts. They're all stacked into a value stream. And then the aggregators that participate in the program are paid on that value stream. And then they also get kickers when they're able to reach and deliver services to disadvantaged communities. And those are substantial incremental savings impacts that are, performance payments that are going for reaching those neighborhoods. It's a fairly simplified approach, and it builds in kind of both the extra cost of being able to reach those customers and build out the infrastructure that you need to deliver services to them, but also it motivates the market to go find those interventions and solve those problems in a meaningful way. That program has been running for about a year now, and it's really driven a lot of local aggregator interest as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about grid value and avoided costs and all that jazz when I come back online.
Great, thanks, Carmen. And then the next slide and last example is just sealed. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for the measured approach in a long time. And so basically what we've done, right, which is pretty typical for measured approach, is we look at past energy usage history, 12 months or more. We basically turn those into coefficients, so usage per day and usage per degree day, which gets integrated into our customers' contracts with us. And then we track that over time, and we see how much energy they've actually saved compared to those baselines. So one of the key things for us, right, has been, as I mentioned before, is data. So you want to have as much data as possible, and you want to keep your portfolio errors as low as possible. And we've been able to do that, not just for electricity and gas, but as I mentioned before, also for delivered fuels. And we think that this is really exciting because we know that the measured approach has to be accessible for all households, particularly in the Northeast, that has a lot of delivered fuels. Next slide. So at a high level, before I just talk a little bit about the policy piece of this and wrap up, the thing that we've really thought about with measured savings and we've experienced as a company in the space is it's kind of like electric vehicles. It's a new thing. It's a different program approach. It's different than deemed and modeled approaches. So it requires new thinking. It requires some new infrastructure wherever you're putting it up. But once you get there, once you set that up, the results are much superior, right? Just like electric vehicles, it's simpler. There are fewer moving parts. It's much more efficient and ultimately much more effective at reducing greenhouse gases and energy bills. So we're really excited about this, and we think that the states have an opportunity to use the IRA money to be able to set the foundation to really make this a reality across the Northeast, we hope, certainly, and across the country. Next slide. So really quickly, the keys to success, next slide, that we see for this is we're really hoping that the federal government, the DOE, as well as states really prioritize the measured path. So this doesn't mean not doing the modeled path, but it does mean making sure to invest in the tools, guidelines, best practices that the states are going to need to be able to move the ball forward with measured, because we actually think it can get to market faster in many cases than modeled. As I mentioned before, aggregator data flexibility is really key, right? Companies like Sealed and many others in the market need to have the flexibility to get data from wherever we can get it from. We can't have utility data sharing be a choke point to the measured approach. And we need to build a competitive market, right? We need to make sure that there are lots of companies, there are lots of aggregators that are competing with each other in the market to make this happen and move away from a command and control approach to program design. And then last but not least, we need to keep it simple, right? One of the great things about measured is you don't have to get a ton of information about these projects, because what you're getting is the most important information around how much energy is actually being saved. And the simpler you make the program, the lower the soft costs in the market. And again, the more private investment and innovation. So really excited for Carmen to now tell you a little bit more about some of the broader implications for the grid that we think the measured approach can take, and happy to answer any questions later on.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Andy. I did see some questions come in. Quick plug, everyone. Please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end. And with that, I will now welcome Carmen from Recurve to talk to us about other aspects of implementing measured saving programs and grid flexibility.
Great. You can go to the next slide, please. So I really wanted to step back and think about this from kind of the context of how folks like Andy are really helping build a bridge between customers and the grid benefits. You can go to the next slide. And I really think of this in a simplified kind of manner. Take a deep breath. What are we trying to do here? What we're trying to do is optimize our energy resources. We're also trying to drive a lot of value for customers as they adapt to a new clean energy economy, right? And this is going to come back down to supply and demand. It's our basic economics. It's been getting a little hairy as we've been looking at how demand side resources fit into the supply side. But what we're also seeing is that demand side resources are really valuable on the supply side. And even though that line isn't crystal clear, we do have a point of transaction with customers, et cetera, that being their meter, where this kind of settlement piece can happen. Customers are buying one thing, utilities are buying another thing, state agencies, et cetera, are buying the resilience, the climate benefits, et cetera, and also the grid benefits for their constituents. So we're all in this together as we balance out this new clean energy system. And next slide. And as we think about how we're building this new energy system, it's important to look at how we've been interpreting energy efficiency in particular over the last many years. The image on the left is kind of a graphic representation of how we quantify energy savings in many states. Many folks have electronic reference manuals now, so they're not in paper form, but in essence, they have been built over engineering models and calculations that really characterize what a deemed savings estimate is going to be. And this has been really effective in getting technologies deployed and really moving the market to improve efficiencies overall, right? Also with codes and standards, et cetera, like these sorts of technology deployments are really important. That's where the savings are actually happening. But on the right-hand side, you'll also see that there's a time value to this, and that is an image of the avoided cost calculator for the summertime periods in California. And what you see is that the calculations that we have that are kind of delimited to an average over a year, sometimes they have the avoided cost baked into them, but what we can really be delivering now in a data-rich environment is a much more time-valued resource, and really align these investments in our infrastructure, which is homes and buildings and businesses, with this grid value. And we need aggregators to be able to build that bridge with them. But they can only do that if they have visibility to these price signals, right? So next slide. You take an example of a past program that we've experimented with in California, and I understand that there's lots of states that have home performance programs that are utilizing a modeled approach. Our experience here in California was that this program suffered from a handful of challenges, one being that the savings impacts were, at the end of the day, really not living up to those modeled expectations. And the reason that we were able to understand that was because as that program was being deployed, and then after the fact,
I think we
all this
lost
investment.
Carmen.
Oh no.
You froze for a second after saying after the fact.
Oh dear.
I think it was like 30 seconds ago. I'll pass it back to you though.
Oh, apologies.
No worries.
Gosh, I don't know what else to do on that front. Okay, so this was an example of a program that has grid value, but it in time, especially with the measured approach. Can you hear me, Erin? Or
yeah, you froze one more time, but I think you're back again. Maybe
okay.
Yeah, you're still going.
Okay. Apologies. Okay, let's move on from this slide. Main point is measure stuff where you can. The other thing that came out of this study, in fact, from the
All right, we lost Carmen one more time. I'll see if she comes back, and if not, yes, we can try turning the camera off. Thank you, Tara.
advanced home upgrade program.
We lost.
I just got kicked off as well. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm at home. Like, I don't know why my Wi-Fi is going goofy right now. Would it be helpful to call in at least, then we'd have audio?
Oh yeah. Or if you want to try turning your video off, we can try that for a little. Whatever you think is best.
Sure. Let's try that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The point of this slide is really just to point out that when we're having these transactions, the customer is really buying one thing, and the utility or the state agency or the other entity, the federal government in this case, is really buying the grid benefits, they're buying the carbon reductions, they're buying this infrastructure component. And I think it's important that we look at those as kind of two sides of perhaps the same coin, in this analogy, a dollar bill. And again, the IRA Homes program really allows us to experiment in this new universe of being able to settle across these different value propositions. So next slide, please. I'll transition then to the Inflation Reduction Act. Andy gave kind of an overview of what the performance incentives look like. Obviously, when this legislation was passed, we're really excited to see that there is a measured performance path, because we think that it'll be able to deliver some really important value for the future, and really build a foundation for which we can be bridging this gap between customer value and grid value, and carbon value, et cetera. We think it's going to be efficient. It has low overhead. It can be layered on top of existing programs as well as we make this transition. And the 15% savings impacts actually can be seen at a portfolio level. So you can be mitigating some of the risk across the portfolio, because we know that results vary amongst participants in these programs. So next slide, please. Let's look at how the incentive calculation actually works. So we've built a little calculator tool, so we can look at any given state. I'm using Connecticut for my Northeast example today. The savings rate is anchored in the energy consumption that's currently the average energy consumption in the state at the time. So that little calculation on the bottom, you take the $2,000, which is the market rate incentive that's available, and then you divide that by a assumed 20% savings across an average customer, and that's what gives you a savings rate. There's a therm component. You convert the kWh into a therm with some BTU stuff. I won't go into that math. And then you have an incentive rate that is tied to how much savings is achieved for a customer over the year. Now, this is a flat rate, right? It doesn't have a time value dimension, but it still is anchored in the variability that you're going to see for any given customer, and also the variability that you're going to see by state. So the incentives for states that maybe have a higher average energy consumption, the rate might be a little bit lower, but the total savings impacts will be higher. For states like California, where the savings, the total consumption is a little bit lower per customer than the incremental impacts, they'll be able to pay for the kind of those incremental impacts that will be delivered. But we can take a look. We'd be happy to go state by state with folks on another call or in a one-on-one to kind of look at what this is going to look like for your state. And this would be a really easy way to do a measured, but not bother too much with that time variable rate. But it's also going to give you that consumption component to it you will have variable outcomes by customer, and it also will be able to optimize with aggregators to be able to deliver the best impacts for customers and target to customers that are going to have the greatest value. Both things which are really important for the program deployment. The other piece, next slide, please, is diving into this time variable rate. And why would you want to do a time variable rate? Well, these are some headlines that have been emerging just in the Northeast. And unfortunately, these are not headlines that are only being seen in the Northeast. We're seeing them across the Midwest, in Texas, California, everywhere. So now is the time really to start thinking and preparing for the ways that we can be optimizing system impacts and leveraging federal dollars from the HOMES program to do that. Next slide, please. Even headlines that one maybe doesn't like or trust the resources, these are the dynamics that are happening in the market. I pulled this slide just on Tuesday as I was preparing my finalizing my deck, and this is not a foreign concept to folks who are running the grid in the Northeast, but I think it's typically fairly detached from what we talk about on a day-to-day basis in the energy efficiency space. But being able to support the grid is really important, and we can be augmenting those impacts without even being party to the supply side markets. Energy efficiency can be grid supportive, even if it's not playing right up and close to the markets. Next slide, please. And one of the ways that you can do that is by leveraging the AMI component of the home performance incentives. So you just need a shape that will align with the time value of the impacts. It doesn't have to be a time of use rate. It could be a time of use rate. It doesn't have to be the avoided cost shape, which is probably hidden somewhere in your TRM, but it could be. You could also make a shape that's just aligned kind of roughly with peak hours. Maybe you talk to a utility, maybe you have it defined by a utility, maybe you talk to your regulatory agency or New England ISO, and you could use that to develop the time varied rate. You could also have a dimension to the time varied rate that is locational. So maybe you'd want to have a higher rate or have kickers that you could couple with other sources of funding to get to locational value, or with carbon funds or GHG funds that could augment the GHG impacts. And you could stack those all up into the home performance rebate, just like the price curve that I was showing earlier in the component in my earlier slides. Thanks. And next slide, please. So the way you could do this, one of the demonstrations that we've put together is if you were to use the California's hourly payment rate, which you don't have to, it's just, we are dealing with the duck curve out here. So it's just kind of a nice, robust shape that everyone's kind of familiar with and has been adapting to over time. If you were to take that and then distribute it out kind of in a blocky fashion, this is how the incentive rates would play out for kind of a gross peak period, a net peak period, a midday, and then an off peak. You could also have those as seasonal dimensions. So you could really classify an hour for any classify the value for any hour of the year as you go through. And then that is made available to aggregators like Sealed or other folks who are operating or Franklin operating in the market. And then as they're preparing business plans, they can be looking at technologies and controls and components to those offerings to customers that will both drive value to customers that are augmented with these savings incentives from homes, but then are also aligned with the grid value or the GHG impacts or whatever combined value proposition that your state might have in mind. So it's a great opportunity to synergize. You know, folks have been talking about layering and stacking, et cetera. I think this new federal funding opportunity is a great chance to experiment with this new dimension and use this inflow of new funding to do that. Here's an example, next slide, please, of how this would look even for a heat pump. We've found in the Franklin study that I was talking about before that these heat pump impacts were actually a very valuable peak investment. And when I first heard that, I thought it was kind of counterintuitive, but indeed, because it was reducing this AC load, heat pumps were really delivering a much more efficient comfort level to customers, but it also was having really positive benefits to the grid. So the overall value of those projects was really high. Next slide, please. The other thing that it enabled was once you do those analyses and when you do have energy consumption data built into the process, it allows you to really start targeting. And that allows you to look at how which customers are really going to be good candidates and offer incentives that are commensurate with the value that they're going to be able to deliver. You're going to be able to find kind of the right price point for those customers, even if you're leveraging, you know, the performance incentives with home performance, which is, you know, it'll be a rate for the state, but you can also be augmenting that with other offerings that might compel the customer to engage. Just gives a lot more flexibility to aggregators in how they're designing and implementing those programs. And there's a lot more studies that I could share on targeting, but I'm going to leave it at that for right now. The last slide or the next slide, I just wanted to highlight how this is really aligning with policy trends in the Northeast. I've been tracking and following the Connecticut activities, the comprehensive energy strategy. They've been doing really interesting work there. I think the home incentive programs really align nicely with the market-based decarbonization programs. You could have the price curve aligned with those GHG obligations and low carbon initiatives. And also the active demand response. These are the types of things that could be layered on top of the home performance activities, and also the building thermal decarbonization, which could be optimizing homes in particular, but also multifamily buildings, and leveraging the home incentives to drive those decarbonization activities. And then my closing slide is really a play on this bridge that we're building. Infrastructure investments are really what we're doing with how I see the Inflation Reduction Act homes program. And that's why I think it's important that we have this flexibility to be delivering on a time valued basis where we can, and really understand how we're building a bridge to the future of how energy efficiency and demand side resources can be part of our long-term energy economy, clean energy economy in particular. So I'll leave it at that. Apologies for the logistical problems, and maybe I'll do another recording to send that doesn't have the glitches in the middle of it. Erin, back to you.
No problem. Thank you so much, Carmen. I would invite Andy and Carmen to turn their cameras on if you're feeling adventurous, Carmen, and we can just see what happens. Yes. And please, everyone, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A. And I'm going to go ahead and just kick us off with some questions that came through as the presentations were going. I'll start with one focused on fuel switching. The Northeast uses a lot of delivered fuels. So some audience participants asked, how would aggregators verify measured savings for people who are switching from delivered fuels? What data is needed? And also, how can we measure weatherization savings for delivered fuels? So I will pass that off to the two of you.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this. As I mentioned, we've been measuring delivered fuels for a long time now. It's definitely a little more challenging than fuels with meters, but it's very doable. There's basically kind of at a high level two things you can do to get data for delivered fuels. The first, it's very simple. Either the customer or somebody else who's helping the customer calls or emails their delivered fuels provider, oil or propane, and requests a ledger, right? This is something that's pretty standard. So you can get, as much data as they have, or at least 12 months of delivered fuel data to be able to do that. And you can do that on an ongoing basis. What you can also do is you can put wireless sensors on the actual fuel tanks. So on a post-project basis, at the very least, you can be able to track the amount of fuel that's used in real time or as real time as you want, which obviously helps to support the measured approach. And this goes for weatherization as well as any electrification that doesn't fully get you off of fossil heating or water heating. So the technology is out there. Again, it's a little bit more than just kind of getting the data from your utility, but we've been doing it for a long time, and it's a very possible and practical thing to do in the market.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on that, where you do have utility data, even the kind of the absence of energy use in the electric data. When you see that conversion to electric, you can kind of you can infer the opposite, where that was coming from as well. So there's different strategies by which you can do that, even if you don't have the absolute values from the delivered fuels. And we also have been working on places where we have natural gas data and electric data. Those are also, we can combine those flows of data to give a combined MMBTU calculation.
Great, thank you. I'll go to the questions that have popped in the Q&A now. So I think the first one is, how are new technologies implemented, or is there an approved product list? I guess when you look at a home, when you look at a project, how do you determine what you can use, what tools are at your disposal to reduce energy savings?
Can I start with that one, Andy? This is one of my favorite features of the program because it's flexible. It's like the super yoga model for how you can be deploying home performance programs. We've seen program models where solar is allowable, battery storage is allowable. If you are getting to savings reductions and peak load reductions in particular when they're adopted for summer reliability situations, it's kind of an all hands on deck. Whatever you can be doing, it really motivates those combined measures and those deeper savings impacts so that you can kind of get to an HVAC plus controls, for example, HVAC plus insulation. And that's really driven by your EUL. If you're doing insulation, you're going to to get a longer EUL for those savings impacts. But there isn't really a product list. It's really up to the aggregator to deliver those services, and then they're able to they're paid based on the performance of those interventions. So the sky's the limit. Figure out how you can optimize that home.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And just to give kind of a sealed example in our kind of version of measured savings in the private market, we've been able to be a lot more flexible than a traditional program that has to run something through a technical resource manual would be, for example, right? Like we look at cool new duct sealing technology, like companies like AeroSeal, and we'll say, hey, if we think it's going to save energy, we want to go pilot that. We want to see what it's going to do. We want to see the impact. We don't really care or need to wait to see if it's going to go through a 2-year technical resource manual review process. It allows innovation in the hardware side of things to be able to move much faster, because there's less of a choke point in terms of being able to create deemed or modeled approaches for those technologies.
Great,
I
thank
was
you.
going to just chime in. I get too excited about this. We've also seen it used as kind of a test case or a lab for emerging tech. So you could be using, if the types of technologies that you're doing are going to have kind of a whole home impact, you can be using that. So you have kind of this single pane of glass of how things are performing, as opposed to having to do a lot of extra research studies. And different dimensionality on evaluation obviously is important of customer product fit and stuff like that. But if you want to see how they're performing at the meter, like, this is a great way to get going.
Awesome, thank you. I wanted to go back to actually the slide that you put up, Andy, about administrative costs under measured versus modeled savings, and how, sorry, my cat's making an appearance, and how measured versus model savings could lead to less administrative costs. Could you expand on that a little bit more? Carmen, also feel free to add in from your experience in California, how the administration looks and how it's able to maybe streamline the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I first want to give a shout out to Erin and her cat. I am often on a Zoom with a cat, so I appreciate the gesture. So yeah, I think it's really important. I think in traditional programs, program implementers are really given an almost impossible job, right? Where you have to basically define a lot of the kind of almost like command and control elements of the program to be successful, right? From a lot of the, branding, marketing, intake, modeling review, right? So part of the costs come in with something like modeling, for example, where you have to have a robust, which you need to have a robust QA process to look over those models. Or you need to be able to spend a lot of money on marketing to drive people down a single path that you've defined. With the measured approach, you're really leaving it up to the market. So you're kind of substituting the money that's being invested by a government or by ratepayers with a lot of private capital that's doing a lot of kind of similar things, but they're doing it in a competitive environment that we think creates a lot more innovation. The one thing that I think is actually the bigger cost that is not realized by the states, but is a bigger impact on the market and market transformation, is really the soft costs in the market, right? The amount of time that it takes for contractors, for example, to fill out energy models or to fill out lots of pieces of information about the project in order to confirm different inputs into models or deemed savings calculations, it's quite a lot. There are contractors that are spending, more than a day per week just doing modeling and paperwork for a lot of these programs. So the measured approach, we think, really focuses accountability where it needs to be, but allows it to keep it simple, which takes away both hard costs from the program administration, but also, I think, more importantly, frankly, soft costs in the market.
I think the other administrative value proposition that I would highlight is you can set it up such that you have an open market that enables lots of different aggregators to come to the table. I was just in a workshop yesterday going over one of the measured programs in California called the Market Access Program, and all of the utilities and the vendors participating in that cited the value of not having to do kind of independent third-party procurements for every single individual aggregator that was coming on board, but you could have a much more streamlined kind of qualifications threshold and requirements to enable folks to just go out and get the work done. You know, they're not going to have the barriers to entry to sign a contract with the utility is really big. Barriers to entry to sign a contract with the state. I used to work at a state agency, and it is really hard. So we want to make sure that this can be deployed in such a way that it's going to enable lots of market actors to go do what they're good at and not learn new skills of, you know, filling out forms and that sort of stuff, but rather focus their efforts on optimizing comfort and security for and resiliency for customers. And then also, you know, where I'd like them to learn a little bit more maybe or build in is the value proposition for the grid, so they can be kind of rewarded for the combined value that they're delivering to the market. And the combined value, because we want more revenue and funding going to this. It's not because doesn't matter to me if they care about the grid or not necessarily, but I want more money to flow to these projects. And if it's delivering that grid value, then that's how I think that it can happen.
Great, thank you both. So we have 5 minutes left. I have 2 topics I want to make sure we hit before we wrap. So the first is going to be how do we focus these programs on low-income customers and ensure benefits are accruing to them? And then I'm going to ask about regulatory changes we'll need to see in the Northeast. So I want to make sure I give you both time to answer those questions. So I'll start with low income. How do we target low-income customers? What kind of programs have been done to make sure these upgrades result in savings, and also watch out for bill impacts?
I can take that one, Andy. I'll just play off quickly on the 3C REN example that I gave in the slide. So that the design there's a market rate program that really has just the base rate of the avoided costs. And then it has a kicker incentive for targeting disadvantaged communities. It's a fairly, since most of that is geographic, it's a fairly easy threshold to qualify customers and make sure that they can be participating in the program, as opposed to having to do a lot of low income verification of who's, having to get financial information from people and that sort of thing. So that is one design. You just keep it very simple. There's extra kickers for going to get those communities. I think one of the other dimensions of that is how do the benefits flow down? I think that's to be determined, kind of how that's going to play out. But I think in most cases, the benefits, like I said, on that flip side of the dollar bill, it's going to be the comfort and those comfort components, but also energy burden. So to address that, we've been working a lot on electrification targeting, particularly with the tech program in California, where we're making sure that the incentives that are going, or the customers that we're engaging with, are likely to experience a bill savings impact and not a negative bill impact. We want their bills to go down, not up. And if their bills go up, there needs to be infrastructure to support them so that when that happens, it's not creating more problems for them. So you could be building out revenue streams for that bill support after the fact if it does happen. But again, that's a measure. That's a way you can use the energy consumption data to make sure that those negative impacts are not happening.
Great,
Andy?
thank you. Do you have anything to add, Andy, or I'm going to pivot us to the last question I want to cover before we hit time?
Awesome. Yeah, the only really quick thing is I think accountability that's built into Measured is really great for low income, because you want to make sure the work is done well, and that's a good way to make it happen.
Great, thank you. So yeah, last question. Coming from the chat, why do so many programs, I'm going to stick to the Northeast, specifically in the Mid-Atlantic, use modeled instead of measured? And what changes do we need kind of in the infrastructure of energy efficiency programs to adapt to this?
Do you mind if I take this one first? So I think it's a really important question, right? And I think it's one of those questions, I made the electric vehicle analogy earlier, that I think is really around change and around people's comfort with change and trying something new and hopefully something better, right? I think that the way that I think about measured is that it's an evolution. It's the next thing. But when in any evolution, right, it takes time, it takes people working together, and it takes experimentation on trying something new. I think the really exciting thing for the Northeast and for all the states is that the IRA is providing federal money to be able to provide the infrastructure to do a lot of this, right? So I think it's really a catalyst for something that needs to happen anyways. And I know a lot of states are kind of talking about it, kind of absent the IRA, but I think this creates a really big opportunity to create that infrastructure to be able to then build on top of that. And I think the really exciting thing for me is that it creates the opportunity for us to turn energy efficiency, which I think for too long has been, at the end of the day, a very noble but ultimately a compliance issue for a lot of in a lot of states and with a lot of programs, into one that turns energy efficiency into a real clean energy resource, right? A lot of the things that Carmen went through talked about how you're actually treating energy efficiency the same way you would treat solar, wind, other renewables, other sources of energy. And I think that for our industry to really expand to the potential that I know it can be, we need to be able to get there. And you can't scale something you can't measure. And so I think that this is a really necessary evolution for our industry. And I think the IRA gives us a bridge to get there.
Back to the bridge metaphor from the end of Carmen's presentation. Anything to add very quickly, Carmen? I understand this is a big question.
No, I would ditto everything that Andy said. I think it's a unique opportunity in the energy transition to transition to different ways that we can be optimizing our data assets, our knowledge, our market innovation, and really start thinking more about how our local resources, those being our homes and businesses, can be serving the grid and serving the people that live in those communities more effectively. And it's great that we have extra funding to give that a go right now. Don't miss out.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Carmen, for coming on this webinar with us. Thank you, everyone who stuck around for an extra minute while I asked one more pressing question. Please mark your calendars for our next Ready, Set, Scale webinar. Will be March 16th. We'll have an exciting new topic coming up there. And then also we have an event coming up in person, Decarbonizing Communities and Campuses. It's a Power Options and NEEP collaboration taking place in the College of Holy Cross on May 3rd, 2023, and it'll specifically look at how communities, campuses can start to decarbonize their buildings and infrastructure. And with that, thank you everyone so much for attending our webinar today. One more great thank you to our panelists, and I hope to see you guys at our next event.